In November 1944, Lucille Ball walked into a Los Angeles courtroom to divorce Desi Arnaz. Reporters were already gathered outside. The date had been in the papers. The judge signed the decree. It was done, and by every legal measure her 4-year marriage to the Cuban bandleader was over. Then she got back in her car, drove home, and climbed into bed with him. She'd spent the night with Desi before the hearing. She went through with the divorce anyway, in the morning, because the press was waiting and she felt she had no choice. And then she went straight back to the man she'd just legally left. Under California law at the time, sleeping together undid the whole thing. The divorce was void. They were still married, and they'd stay married for another 16 years. That single day tells you almost everything about Lucille Ball and Desi Arnaz. Two people who could not stay together and could not stay apart. Who built the most famous marriage in America on television every week, while the real one came apart behind the soundstage. She had already lived with his ex-girlfriend to escape the loneliness of their ranch. She would go on to build a television empire with him, raise 2 children with him, and stand across from him in a courtroom one final time in 1960, telling a judge he was like Jekyll and Hyde. Booze and broads, she called it. The drinking. The other women. The nights he stopped coming home. Millions of people tuned in every week to watch Lucy and Ricky love each other. Almost none of them knew that the woman making America laugh was going home to a marriage that was quietly destroying her. This is the story of how the most powerful woman in Hollywood fell for a man she couldn't fix, kept forgiving him longer than anyone understood, and finally chose herself, after 20 years, 2 divorces, and one that didn't even count. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. They came from opposite ends of everything, and both of them were broke by the time they met. Lucille Ball was born in August 1911 in Jamestown, New York, a mill town near the Pennsylvania line. Her father was a telephone lineman named Henry, and the family followed his work from New York to Montana to Michigan. In February 1915, in Wyandotte, Michigan, he caught typhoid fever and died. He was 27. Lucille was 3. Her mother, Dede, was pregnant with a second child at the time. The only thing Lucille remembered from the day her father died was a bird that got trapped in the house. She was scared of birds for the rest of her life. She wouldn't stay in hotel rooms with bird patterns on the wallpaper. Dede took the children back to Celeron, a little resort village on Chautauqua Lake, and the grandparents helped raise them. When Dede remarried and moved to Detroit for a stretch, Lucille was left behind with her stepfather's parents, strict Puritan types who ran the house on the principle that life was to be endured and not enjoyed. She learned to disappear into her own head. Later she'd call it the beginning of her acting. Then came the accident that flattened them. Her grandfather was supervising some kids' target shooting on the property when a neighbor boy stepped into the line of fire and was hit. The bullet severed his spine. A court found the family liable, and what little they had was gone. 2,000 miles south, Desi Arnaz was growing up as the exact opposite kind of child. He was born in Santiago de Cuba in 1917, an only son, almost stupidly privileged. His father was the youngest mayor Santiago ever had, and later a congressman. His mother was a granddaughter of one of the founders of Bacardi rum. The family owned ranches, dairy farms, a mansion, a villa on a private island. Desi was being groomed for law school and then politics. That was the whole plan for his life. In August 1933, the plan burned down, in some cases literally. A military coup brought Fulgencio Batista to power, and the mob turned on families like the Arnazes. They torched the ranches, killed the livestock, ransacked the homes. Desi's father was thrown in jail for 6 months. When the family finally got out, they landed in Miami with nothing. The teenage heir who'd been raised for the Cuban Senate was now sleeping on a cot in a warehouse, eating beans out of a can with his father, and cleaning bird cages for $15 a week. So by the time these two crossed paths, one had come up from nothing and clawed her way toward Hollywood, and the other had fallen from everything and was rebuilding from the floor. Different directions, same hunger. That's the collision that was coming. The first thing Lucille Ball ever said about Desi Arnaz was an insult. The first thing she said to his face, more or less, was surrender. It was the spring of 1940. RKO had bought the rights to a Broadway hit called Too Many Girls, and Lucille was cast as the lead. She'd been in Hollywood for years by then, grinding through more than 50 films, mostly small parts, the kind of career where you're always working and never quite breaking through. She was 28. She was good, she was tough, and she was tired of being almost famous. Her leading man was a problem, as far as she was concerned. He was a Cuban band leader with no film experience, cast off the strength of the stage version, and she didn't like the sound of it. In the RKO commissary one day, standing in the lunch line with her friend Maureen O'Hara, she was complaining about the whole thing. She called him that Cuban. She hadn't met him. She hadn't even seen him. Then he walked into the room. O'Hara had met Desi before, in New York, and knew exactly what was about to happen. She told Lucille to look for herself. Lucille looked. According to O'Hara, the first words out of her mouth were, "Oh my God." O'Hara said she could practically hear the bells going off in her friend's head. The catch, and there's always a catch with these two, is that they were both already spoken for. Lucille was briefly engaged to a director named Al Hall. Desi was involved with a dancer named Renee DeMarco. Neither engagement lasted the week. They spent a night together within days of meeting, then both got on the phone and ended things with the people waiting for them at home. That was the pattern from the very first move. Total, reckless, all in, and slightly chaotic. Desi's opening line to her, by some accounts, was to ask whether she knew how to rumba. She didn't, really. He offered to teach her. It's almost too on the nose for a story about a Cuban musician and a redhead from upstate New York, but that's how it went. What makes the beginning worth slowing down on is how unlikely it was on paper. She usually went for men who were older and taller. He was younger than her by 6 years, and not much taller. She was the established star. He was the unknown. She had clawed up from a childhood of death and debt in a New York mill town. He had fallen out of a Cuban mansion into a Miami warehouse. By any rational Hollywood calculation, this was not a match. They fell in love anyway, hard, and neither of them ever fully explained it, because there wasn't a tidy explanation. It just happened, fast, and it never really let go of either of them for the rest of their lives. But the warning signs were already there. They were there in the first month. There's a letter Lucille wrote him in October of 1940, before they were even married. She was 29. She told him she thought about him all day and all night. And then, in the same breath, she begged him. "Please don't jeopardize the next few months with these awful dames I dislike so," she wrote. "Please don't prefer them instead of me. Really, darling, it won't be worth it. Read that again, and remember they weren't married yet." She was already pleading with him about other women before there was a marriage to protect. Desi had a reputation as a ladies' man long before Lucille, and it followed him into the relationship and never left. Their daughter Lucille, decades later, would try to explain her father's affairs in the strangest possible defense. She said, he never actually had affairs, because he never learned the women's names. They were transactions, she said, hookers. He loved his family, and he did this anyway, and it was, in her words, a very weird problem to have. That was the man Lucille was writing love letters to in 1940, eyes open, warning him off before the wedding. She married him anyway. On November 30th, 1940, roughly 6 months after she first laid eyes on him in that commissary, they eloped. There was no grand Hollywood wedding. They drove out to Greenwich, Connecticut, and got married in a small ceremony at a place called the Byram River Beagle Club. Desi, in the rush, had forgotten to buy a ring. He grabbed one from a Woolworth's 5 and dime on the way. The most famous marriage in the history of American television started with a dime store wedding ring, and then real life started immediately, because their careers pulled in opposite directions from day one. As soon as the film wrapped, Desi went off to Chicago to tour with the stage version of Too Many Girls, while Lucille stayed in Hollywood to shoot her next picture. He was a band leader. That meant nights, travel, hotels, and a constant supply of exactly the temptation she'd written to him about. She was a movie actress on a studio schedule, tied to Los Angeles. They had married in a hurry, and then, almost right away, they were living in different cities, connected by long-distance phone calls and letters. The love was real. Nobody who knew them ever seriously doubted that. But the architecture of their lives was cracked from the foundation. Two ambitious people, both climbing, both stubborn, both far from home in their own ways, married after 6 months and then kept apart by the very work that had brought them together. It held for a while. It even looked, from the outside, like it might work. Then came 1944, and the first time Lucille Ball tried to leave. Even the way they got together had a woman in the middle of it. That should have told everyone something. Go back to those first few days in 1940. Their very first night out was actually tame, and only because of a scheduling problem. Desi's girlfriend, a dancer he'd nicknamed Freckles, was arriving in town, so he had to behave. A few days later, he took Freckles to a beach house party in Malibu. Lucille was there. She patted the sand next to her and asked him to sit down. He sat. In his own words, he never went back to Freckles. He walked away from the woman he'd brought and into a marriage that would define both their lives. That's a charming story if you're 28 and in love. It's a warning if you're paying attention. The man who left one woman on a beach the moment a better option patted the sand was not going to become a different man once there was a ring on his finger. And the ring, remember, came from a Woolworth's. The first 4 years of the marriage were a slow-motion demonstration of everything Lucille had feared in that pre-wedding letter. Desi led a band. Bands travel. He was on the road for long stretches, playing clubs late into the night, surrounded by exactly the temptations she'd begged him to avoid. She was stuck on a studio schedule in Los Angeles. They were married, but they were rarely in the same city, and when they were, their hours didn't line up. Her writers later said, the whole thing was a structural trap. One of them, Bob Weisskopf, put it plainly. Lucille was afraid he'd cheat on the road, and she believed the marriage stood a better chance if she could just get him to stay home. She couldn't. Not then. The affairs weren't rumors to her. They were a fact of the marriage, reported in the scandal magazines, humiliating and public. There was a confidential story about a Palm Springs weekend of his that she said cut her deeply, precisely because everyone read it. She was a movie star, being told by a national magazine that her husband was stepping out on her. And she was living alone on their ranch in Chatsworth, north of Los Angeles, waiting for a man who, during the summer of 1944, simply stopped coming home. So in 1944, she did something drastic, and it says a lot about her state of mind. She filed for divorce, and in the strange months before it was final, she went to stay with, of all people, Renee DeMarco, the same dancer Desi had been seeing when they first met. The two women had somehow become friends. That's how alone Lucille was. She fled her marriage and found company with her husband's ex-girlfriend. Then came the day the whole story turns on, the one from the very start of this video. The divorce in California at that time wasn't instant. There was a provisional decree and then a waiting period, and crucially, the law said the couple couldn't live together during that window or the divorce would be void. The final court date was set for November 1944. The press knew about it. Reporters were already planning to gather at the courthouse. The night before Lucille was supposed to appear, Desi called and invited her to a farewell dinner. Just a goodbye, supposedly. Two people closing the book on 4 hard years. The dinner went well. It went so well that, in the words of the biographer who reconstructed it, they wound up in bed. The night before her own divorce hearing, Lucille spent the night with the man she was divorcing. The next morning she woke up in a panic, saying she was late. Desi, understandably confused after the night they'd just had, asked her where she could possibly be going. She told him, "I'm divorcing you this morning." She said she had to go through with it, because the reporters were already at the courthouse, and it would be a spectacle if she didn't show, so she went. She stood in front of the judge, got her decree, and made her marriage legally over. And then she drove home and got right back into bed with Desi. Under California law, that was the whole thing undone. There was a 1-year ban on living together after the provisional decree, and they'd broken it before the ink was dry. The two of them lay in bed that afternoon, reading the newspapers announce their divorce. A divorce that, by their own actions that same day, no longer existed. They were still married. They'd never really stopped being married. They just went back to the ranch, and Desi, for a while, started coming home on the weekends. Sit with how insane that is for a second. She wanted out badly enough to file, to move in with his ex, to stand before a judge with the press outside, and she wanted him badly enough to blow the entire thing up within 24 hours, on the very day it was granted. That contradiction wasn't a one-time lapse. That contradiction was the marriage. She could not stay, and she could not leave, and for another 16 years both of those things stayed true at the same time. The reconciliation was real, though, and it changed the shape of their lives, because now they'd both seen how close it had come, and Lucille's instinct, the one her writer described, hardened into a plan. If the road was the enemy, get him off the road. If the problem was that his work took him away from her, then they needed work that kept them together. Same city, same building, same schedule, a project they could do side by side, where she could see him every day. She had no idea, in 1944, that the solution to her marriage was going to be a television show. Nobody did. Television barely existed yet, but the seed was planted in the wreckage of that fake divorce. Keep him close, build something together. And a few years later, when a radio show she was doing got the attention of the networks, that instinct would turn into the most influential sitcom ever made, and the strangest marriage-saving scheme in show business history. The thing to understand about I Love Lucy is that Lucille Ball didn't create it to change television. She created it to save her husband from himself, and changing television was almost an accident along the way. By the late 1940s, she'd found real success on the radio. From 1947, she starred in a CBS show called My Favorite Husband, playing a scatterbrained wife, and it was a hit. When television started swallowing radio whole, CBS came to her with an offer: bring the character to TV. This was a big deal. She was finally being handed the lead role that a decade of movie near misses had denied her. She said yes, with one condition. Desi had to play her husband. CBS said no, flatly. Their reasoning was ugly, and they didn't much bother hiding it. They didn't believe American audiences would accept a red-headed all-American woman married on screen to a Cuban man with a heavy accent. Never mind that she actually was married to him. The network looked at a real marriage and told the couple that middle America wouldn't buy it. One podcast historian later called it exactly what it was: a racist decision. Here's where Lucille's whole hard-won instinct kicked in. She wasn't just fighting for a co-star. She was fighting for the plan she'd been chasing since the fake divorce of 1944. Get Desi off the road, get him in the same building, same schedule, a job they'd do together, every day, where she could keep him in her sight and out of the hotel bars and away from the women. The TV show wasn't just a career move. It was a marriage rescue operation disguised as a sitcom. So when CBS refused, she refused right back and walked. And then she and Desi did something clever to prove the executives wrong. In the summer of 1950, they put together a live vaudeville act and took it on the road themselves. Desi led his band, and Lucille barged into the act as the clowning wife, hauling a cello on stage, mugging, interrupting him, demanding to audition. Audiences roared. The mixed marriage couple the network was so nervous about turned out to be exactly what people wanted to watch. Night after night, city after city, they made the case in front of live crowds that CBS couldn't make in a boardroom. The network caved. They'd shoot a pilot. Now came the second fight, and this one is the reason you've heard of any of this at all. Because in winning it, Lucille and Desi accidentally built the modern television industry. They insisted on two things CBS hated. First, they refused to move to New York, where nearly all TV was made and broadcast live. They wanted to stay in Los Angeles to raise a family. Second, and much bigger, Desi insisted the show be shot on 35mm film in front of a live studio audience, using 3 cameras running at once. Nobody made scripted TV that way. Live television was broadcast once and gone. The picture quality outside New York was terrible, and coordinating 3 film cameras with a live audience was considered close to impossible. CBS balked because film was expensive. It roughly doubled the cost. And this is the moment the whole story turns on, though it looked at the time like a minor accounting dispute. Desi made them a deal. He and Lucille would take a pay cut, $1,000 a week off their own salary, to cover the extra cost of shooting on film. In exchange, their production company, Desilu, would own the finished episodes outright. CBS took the deal. It seemed like a good trade for the network. Let the couple eat the cost, hand them some worthless film cans, keep the cash. What CBS didn't grasp, what almost nobody grasped in 1951, was that owning those film reels meant owning the show forever. It meant reruns. It meant syndication. It meant that a filmed episode could be sold and resold and aired for decades. Lucille and Desi had just quietly invented one of the most valuable ideas in entertainment, and they'd gotten the network to agree to it by pretending to make a sacrifice. I Love Lucy premiered on October 15, 1951. It was an instant, staggering hit. Within its first season, it shot to the top of the ratings, and it stayed there. Lucille's physical comedy, the grape stomping, the assembly line chocolate scene, the Vitamita Vegamin bit where she gets drunk filming a commercial, made her the most famous woman in America. Desi's Ricky Ricardo, the exasperated bandleader trying to manage his chaos of a wife, turned him into a beloved star and a shrewd producer running every technical detail behind the camera. And the marriage-saving scheme worked, at first. They were together now, every day, in the same studio. He wasn't on the road, he was home. The thing she'd wanted since 1944 had finally come true. They even wove the marriage deeper into the show. When Lucille got pregnant during the second season, they wrote the pregnancy into the storyline, which television simply did not do in the early 1950s. The word pregnant was considered too vulgar to say on air. They had to use expecting. The episode where Lucy has her baby aired in January 1953, on the very same day Lucille actually gave birth to their son, Desi Jr. More than 2/3 of American homes with a television watched it. It drew a bigger audience than the presidential inauguration the next morning. From the outside, in 1953, it looked perfect. The #1 show in the country, a real marriage, and a fictional one feeding each other. 2 kids, a studio, Desilu, growing so fast it went from 12 employees to hundreds in a few years, eventually becoming the company that would produce Star Trek, Mission Impossible, and The Untouchables. In 1962, Lucille would become the first woman to run a major Hollywood studio, but the plan had a flaw buried inside it. And the flaw was the same one from the very beginning. Lucille had built an entire empire to keep Desi close, believing proximity would fix him. It didn't fix him, it just gave him more money, more power, more pressure, and more temptation than a touring bandleader had ever dreamed of. The success she'd engineered to save the marriage was about to become the thing that destroyed it. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything, and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one. The cruel joke of the whole thing is that Lucille got exactly what she asked for, and it made everything worse. She had wanted him off the road and in the studio. Now he was in the studio, but he wasn't just an actor showing up to hit his marks. Desi was running Desilu. And Desilu, built on the back of I Love Lucy, was exploding into one of the biggest production companies in Hollywood, growing from a dozen employees to hundreds in a few years. Desi was the president of it. He oversaw the cameras, the film, the deals, the expansion, the other shows the company was taking on. By some accounts, he was working 14-hour days. He was not built to carry that, or at least the drinking told him he wasn't. The pressure of being the businessman behind the empire, plus the strange humiliation of being known around town as Mr. Lucille Ball, the man whose wife's name was in the title, fed something that had probably always been in him. He drank more. Then he drank a lot. His son later described a decade-long battle with alcohol that wrecked his health and the marriage both. Lucille put it starkly years afterward. She said she watched it all fall apart, and that drinking is so destructive, But it was his life, not a habit, his life. And the drinking came with the other thing, the thing she'd been begging him to stop since before the wedding. The women never went away. If anything, money and fame and late nights made it easier. The affairs were so open by the mid-1950s that they were being printed in national magazines, while the couple sat at #1 in the ratings, playing America's Happiest Marriage every Monday night. There's a scene that captures the whole grotesque situation better than any summary could. It was a rehearsal day. The scandal magazine Confidential was about to run a story calling Desi a womanizer, laying out his nightlife. Lucille's publicist got an advance copy. Lucille heard about it and said she wanted to read it. She took the magazine into her dressing room, and the entire set just froze. Cast, crew, everyone stood there in silence, waiting, while the most famous woman in America sat alone, reading a national exposé of her husband's cheating. She came out. She tossed the magazine back to Desi, and she said, "Oh, hell, I could tell them worse than that." That line is the marriage in 8 words. The toughness, the gallows humor, the exhaustion, the awful private knowledge that the published version was the sanitized one. She knew more than Confidential knew. She'd known since 1940. She just kept absorbing it, kept covering, kept the show running, because the show was the marriage and the marriage was the show, and pulling one thread would unravel both. Other people saw it too. Barbara Eden, later famous from I Dream of Jeannie, guest starred on I Love Lucy in 1957. She wrote plainly in her memoir that there was no doubt whatsoever Desi Arnaz was a world-class philanderer. This was not a secret in Hollywood. It was a fact everyone worked around. Their daughter Lucy, decades later, offered that strange defense again, the one that somehow makes it sadder rather than better. She insisted her father never really had affairs because he never learnt the women's names. They were transactions, hookers, she said. He loved his family and did this anyway, and she called it a very weird problem to have. Whatever you make of that framing, picture it from Lucille's side. It might be easier to fight a mistress you can name than a rotating parade of strangers who mean nothing, because there's nothing to fix, no rival to beat, just a compulsion that keeps going no matter how successful, how rich, how celebrated the marriage becomes. And Desi was becoming a different person at home. Lucille later told the court it was like living with Jekyll and Hyde. He'd have tantrums in front of friends and relatives. For the last 3 or 4 years, she said, they could have no social life at all, because she never knew which version of him would show up. The charming bandleader the whole country adored on Monday nights was, by the weekend, someone she was managing, hiding, apologizing for. The children saw it up close, and they remembered it for the rest of their lives. Desi Jr. and Lucy both later described a house full of arguing. Desi Jr. said it plainly. It wasn't good for anyone. He remembered, word for word, the day his parents sat the 2 kids down and told them things weren't working. That's the part the reruns never show. While 2/3 of America was laughing at Lucy and Ricky, the real children of the real couple were being sat on a couch and told the family was breaking. Here's the trap they were both caught in, and it's worth naming clearly because it's the engine of the whole tragedy. The show required them to be together constantly. Their fame, their fortune, and hundreds of employees' jobs all depended on the Ricardos being in love. But being together constantly meant Lucille had a front-row seat to every drink and every absence and every magazine story, and Desi had the pressure of an empire crushing him into the bottle. The very closeness she'd engineered to save him was grinding them both down. She couldn't get relief by leaving, because leaving would end the show, and she couldn't get peace by staying, because staying meant watching. They tried to outrun it with work, which is the oldest mistake in the book. I Love Lucy proper ended its run in 1957, and they rolled straight into a follow-up, the Lucy-Desi Comedy Hour, stretching the partnership out even as the marriage underneath it was dying. More shows, more Desilu, more reasons they couldn't just stop and deal with what was actually happening. By the late 1950s, Lucille later said, her marriage had become a nightmare, and she used that exact word to the court about the final 3 years. The woman who had blown up her own divorce in 1944 to climb back into bed with this man had reached a place where the love, Whatever was left of it was no longer enough to live inside the wreckage. She had spent 16 years trying to save him. She was about to accept that she couldn't, and that trying was killing her. The second divorce was coming. This time there would be no farewell dinner. This time it would stick. The end, when it finally came, was arranged with a cruelty no writer would have dared invent. The last thing Lucille Ball and Desi Arnaz ever did together on screen was kiss and make up. By early 1960, the decision was already made. The marriage was over in every way except legally, and both of them knew it. The children had been sat down and told. What remained was one last piece of business: the final episode of the Lucy Desi Comedy Hour. The specials they'd been making since I Love Lucy ended its weekly run. The episode was called Lucy Meets the Mustache, with Ernie Kovacs and Edie Adams as guests. They filmed it on March 2nd, 1960. It happened to be Desi's 43rd birthday. Desi directed it himself. Not because he wanted to. He later said he'd have preferred to hand it to one of their other directors. But they were all busy. So the man whose marriage was ending had to stand behind the camera and stage his own goodbye. And the script, written long before anyone planned the timing, called for the story to end the way these stories always ended. A quarrel resolved, a long embrace, a kiss, and a fade-out. Desi described that moment in his memoir. They got to the final scene. They knew it was the last time they would ever be Lucy and Ricky. They looked at each other, embraced, and kissed. 20 years of marriage, 9 years of the most beloved couple in the history of television, ending on a soundstage with a scripted kiss, performed for a studio audience that had no idea it was watching a funeral. The next morning, March 3rd, 1960, Lucille filed for divorce in Santa Monica Superior Court. One day after the final episode, one day after his birthday, she was done waiting, done timing things around the show, because there was no more show to protect. The legal grounds were extreme cruelty, causing grievous mental suffering, which was the standard language of the era. But what she said in court went well past boilerplate. This was one of the most famous women alive, describing under oath a marriage the whole country believed in. She told the court it had been a nightmare for the last 3 years, nothing like what people saw on television. She said he was like Jekyll and Hyde. He drank, he gambled, he went around with other women. It was always the same, she said. Booze and broads. He'd have tantrums in front of friends and relatives. For years they'd had no social life at all, because she couldn't risk what he might do in a room full of people. And then the line that carried the whole weight of it, the closest she came to explaining 20 years in one sentence. It got so bad that I thought it would be better for us not to be together. Think about who was saying that. This was the woman who, in 1944, divorced him in the morning and undivorced him by the afternoon. The woman who built an entire television empire, invented a production model, and reshaped an industry substantially as a scheme to keep this man home. She had bet everything on the idea that enough closeness, enough success, enough shared work could outweigh what he was. In that courtroom she was conceding the bet. The divorce was finalized on May 4th, 1960. There was no dramatic contest over it. Desi didn't fight. In his own memoir, he'd been disarming about his lying over the years, joking that if she'd caught him in bed with a girl, unless it was right in the middle of the act, he'd have jumped up and demanded to know how the girl got in there. He was charming even about the thing that destroyed them. That was always the problem. The charm never stopped working, even after everything else did. Lucille later called this period one of the darkest of her life, and part of what she grieved was strange and public. She talked about the disappointment it caused the fans. She carried the audience's broken heart on top of her own. Millions of people had organized some idea of love around Lucy and Ricky, and she felt the weight of taking it from them, as though the fiction had been a promise she was personally breaking. The final episode aired on April 1st, 1960, a month after the filing, so America watched The Last Kiss, already knowing it was over. Edie Adams sang a song in that episode called That's All. She later suggested she hadn't fully grasped what was happening around her when she sang it. The title did the work anyway. What happened to the empire tells you how the power had shifted. 2 years later, in 1962, Lucille bought out Desi's share of Desilu. The studio they'd built to save the marriage was now hers alone, and with it she became the first woman to run a major Hollywood studio. Under her watch, Desilu greenlit Star Trek and Mission Impossible, two franchises still printing money 6 decades later. Years on, she sold the company to Gulf and Western for $17 million. The little production outfit, founded on a 5-acre ranch and a pay cut, had become one of the great fortunes in television, and it ended up in her hands, not his. Desi drifted away from the business he had, in a real sense, invented. He remarried in 1963 to a woman named Edith Hirsch, and by most accounts that marriage was calm in all the ways his first one never was. Lucille remarried too, in 1961, to a comedian named Gary Morton, and stayed with him until her death. On paper, that's the end. 2 divorces, one that didn't count and one that did. 2 remarriages, assets divided, empire transferred, lives separated. But this story has never once behaved the way it should on paper, because the strangest chapter of Lucille and Desi wasn't the marriage, it was what came after it. Divorce, in most stories, is the ending. In this one, it was just the point where the story turned into something stranger and, in its own way, gentler than the marriage had ever managed to be. Once they weren't married anymore, Lucille and Desi got along better than they had in years. Their daughter Lucy would later insist that the divorce was the best thing that ever happened to the family, and she meant it as praise, not tragedy. She described what came after as a romance that grew more passionate and more friendly, precisely because the pressure was gone. They didn't have to run a studio together, protect a brand together, or perform a marriage for a live audience every week. They could just be 2 people who had loved each other badly, and now, unexpectedly, got to love each other well. They played cards together. Lucy remembered visits where her mother and father would sit for hours, easy with each other, in a way they rarely managed when the cameras and the contracts were real. When Desi's health began to fail decades later, Lucille came to see him, and Lucy ran and grabbed every old I Love Lucy tape she could find in the house. Her parents sat together and watched their younger selves for hours, laughing, remembering. Lucy shut the door and let them have the time. She said it felt like sending 2 kids on a first date. Desi remarried in 1963 to a woman named Edith Hirsch, and by most accounts it gave him something closer to the calm he'd never managed to build with Lucille. Lucille remarried too, to the comedian Gary Morton, and stayed with him for the rest of her life. Both of them, in other words, found steadier ground with someone else, but neither of them let go of the other. Desi's second marriage ended with Edith's death in 1985. He was alone again, and not long after, in early 1986, doctors found lung cancer. His physician later said plainly what caused it: the Cuban cigars he'd smoked for most of his adult life. He went through chemotherapy and radiation at a hospital in La Jolla, and it became clear, faster than anyone wanted, that it wasn't working. He moved to a house in Del Mar to spend what time he had left. Lucy stayed with him and nursed him through it. She didn't want him to be alone. On November 30th, 1986, Lucille called. Nobody in the room registered, in the moment, what the date meant. It was Desi's health that everyone was tracking, hour by hour, not the calendar. Lucy was at her father's bedside. He was barely able to speak or eat anymore. The cancer had taken that much from him. She held the phone up to his ear and said, "It's the redhead." And then Lucille said, the only thing left to say. Not a speech, not a summary of 20 years of marriage and 26 years of divorce. Just, "I love you." Lucy listened and heard her mother say it again and again, 5 times in a row, each one with a slightly different weight, like she was trying to get the words exactly right before it was too late to say them at all. Desi found the strength to answer. "I love you too, honey," he said. By some accounts, he added a little more. "Good luck with your show." It was only afterward, when Lucy went back through her diary, that she realized what day it had been. November 30th was the day, 46 years earlier, that a young bandleader had bought a ring at a Woolworth's in a rush and married a movie actress at a small club in Connecticut. Neither Lucille nor Desi seemed to have planned it that way. Nobody had circled the date and decided to make it meaningful. It just happened to be their anniversary, the last time either of them would ever speak to the other, and neither of them knew it as they were saying it. Desi died 2 days later, on December 2nd, 1986. He was 69. Lucy was with him. He died, as she put it, in his daughter's arms. Lucille released a short statement afterward, and there's nothing performed about it. Our relationship had remained very close, very amiable over the years, she said. And now I'm grateful to God that Desi's suffering is over. She attended his funeral in Solana Beach, a small private service, about 100 people. Witnesses said she wept. Desi had one more thing waiting. He'd written a message for Lucille, meant to be delivered at the Kennedy Center Honors, where she was about to be recognized for a lifetime of work that had started, in a real sense, the day he walked into an RKO commissary and made her say, "Oh my God." He didn't live to deliver it himself. His friend, the actor Robert Stack, read it for him, 5 days after Desi's death, in front of an audience honoring the woman he'd loved since 1940 and never fully stopped loving, even after everything he'd put her through. Lucille lived another 3 years. She died in April 1989, at 77, from a heart condition. Look back at everything this story actually was. It started with a girl from a dead-end mill town and a boy who lost a mansion in a single summer, colliding in a lunch line because a friend happened to point him out. It ran through a divorce so brief the law itself refused to recognize it. It built the most influential structure in the history of television as, essentially, a desperate act of marital first aid. It broke, publicly, painfully, exactly the way she'd feared it would, since before the wedding even happened. And then, once neither of them had anything left to protect or perform, it became something almost nobody expects a failed marriage to become. Real tenderness, held onto until the very last conversation either of them ever had. They were not a tragedy that ended in divorce. They were a love that never figured out how to survive being married, and finally, 46 years after it started, said everything it needed to say in 5 words, repeated 5 times, into a dying man's ear. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you loved this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.